All right, so here I go. I'm going to give my comments and stuff to his rebuttal. There's a lot of stuff that I need to go over here. I'm not going to give a list of all the things, like a summary of all the things I'm going to talk about, because I'm just going to address all the things that he said in that rebuttal. So if you've watched his rebuttal, then you know all the things I'm going to comment on. But I'll at least remind you the thing that I'm commenting on. So for example, when he was talking about divine simplicity, I want to clarify something here, a slight clarification for divine simplicity. It is not that the attributes of God are all the same. It is rather that God has no attributes. God has no properties. So what we call the love of God or the knowledge of God are in fact one thing. It's sort of like monism, where all apparent properties are actually one and the same substance. The monistic view is that everything that you see and experience, all the different stuff is actually just one substance that's like interacting with itself. So like these individual particles aren't really individual particles. They are this one substance, whatever that might be, depends on your monistic view. So kind of like think about God in that way, that it's not that God has something, God has love, God has knowledge, God has power, but it's rather that these things are by analogy, because God is this one single thing in which when it expresses itself, you might think of this as love from our point of view, or this as power from our point of view, but in fact it's an expression of one single entity, one nature being expressed. So this is not saying that love and knowledge are the same thing. Rather, it is saying that God and his nature is one. The way God and his nature we can understand like as love or as knowledge or as power. And that's why we're using these words analogically. So rather, something like knowledge in God is something like power in God. Not that property power is the same as property knowledge. And so this whole part where he talks about this is like a logical problem to say that power is the same as knowledge or love is the same as knowledge or whatever doesn't work here, because we're not saying that. We're not saying that God has properties at all, or even that God has one single property. God has zero properties. He then went on about evolution and how there's like gradual changes throughout species from one species to another. How do we account for this, with this idea of forms? Well, how can we account for the gradual steps in species when it evolves? Does every step in the gradient of species have its own form? That's with a question mark. So potentiality. Species have inherent properties that can be actualized over time through evolutionary processes. For instance, like the potential for a fish to develop limbs and eventually become a land-dwelling creature is present in the fish's nature. That is, that potential for the fish to become a land-walking creature is present in the very, it's, how do I word this? It's a potential within the fish's nature. Right? So the form accounts for how a species is in the world, which includes its ability to change over time. So no, not every gradual change is a new form. For example, my form accounts for a wide range of material change. Remember, what is changing are accidental properties, that is the material, and these are not necessary. My hair can change, I can lose a limb, I can be born without eyeballs, and yet I'm still me. The form human, which is in every human, accounts for these changes without the human being another species. The same is true if these changes happen over time via genetic mutations. The form accounts for these accidental changes, these accidental properties. We could ask the same question of anything, though. How does a boat stop being a boat? How many parts can I remove before we say, okay, that is no longer a boat? Or how many molecules can we remove from a box before it stops being a box? The form of the box accounts for that change. There doesn't need to be a bunch of forms for that gradual change, because a box is still a box until it ceases to be a box. Once it ceases to be a box, then there's a new form there. And when that happens, it's just as much of a problem. That is, when exactly that happens is just as much of a problem for physicalists as it is for anyone else. Now, we could hash this idea out more if necessary. I remember at some point he talked about like a logical thinking thing and a rational mind, and I can't remember exactly what he was talking about right now and where that was in his rebuttal, but you'll remember if you just got through watching it and then you're watching my rebuttal. And so I wrote down the notes of what I wanted to respond about. And that is, well, the rational mind is a phrase used for the soul, but it is not the whole idea of what a soul is. A soul is rational, but it is specially able to contemplate its own existence, purpose, what is God, etc. It's not just merely a logical thinking thing. And so I remember he pointed out some problem like, well, if we're just like logical thinking things, and like what about other things that are logically thinking things? Would they have souls? Something like that. As far as, when in evolution did we call human beings, or what we call human beings, gain the rational soul? Well, we don't know. But it would be when Homo sapiens would think on higher levels of thought, like, what am I? Who am I? Where do I go when I die? Do I have any purpose for existing? Is there something that created me like a god? What is existence, etc.? In other words, once we're able to think philosophically, that's when we were granted a soul. So the soul is more than just like a logically thinking thing. It's being able to think about all of these higher thoughts. So a crow might be a logical thinking animal, but it's not a rational mind. It's not something that contemplates like these philosophical concepts. And by the way, in my view, any material form that evolves to the level where it has a brain capable of doing this, that is, of these rational philosophical type thoughts, then God will grant it a rational soul, including artificial intelligence. If AI ever reaches human level awareness, then it will be granted a rational soul, or it will not. That is, if God decides not to, then we'll never have AI that thinks anything like us. That is, we'll never have AI that can truly think about these things like we think about these things, unless God grants it a soul. That doesn't mean it'll recognize or believe it has a soul, because look how many atheists believe they don't have a soul. So next, Drace gets into this idea of divine simplicity again, but this time pointing out abstracts like geometry and numbers being God's knowledge, and since God is the same as his knowledge, then he is the same as the thing that is his knowledge. Right, so he says something here that's not correct, which is that God is identical to his properties. Well, one, God has no properties to be identical to, as I said earlier. So rather, God is his own existence. But I still need to address this other problem. And that is, well, if God is the same as 1 and 3, and therefore 1 equals 3, well, no. But why not? Because there's a difference between God intrinsically as knowledge and that which God has knowledge about, which is extrinsic or extrinsic. This problem is one I think I created because when Drace asked me if abstract things like numbers are real, I said yes. This was not in the context of this debate. This was outside the context of this debate. I said, yes, they are real in God. Well, and this can be confusing, so let me clarify. In St. Thomas Aquinas' view, numbers exist in the mind of God as part of his perfect knowledge. They have real existence as abstract concepts because they correspond to the quantitativeness aspect of what is real. Physical things in the world, for example, while God's knowledge is indeed identical with his essence, the objects of that knowledge, such as numbers, are not. God's knowledge is a single, simple act of understanding that encompasses all truths. But this does not mean he is the same as those truths. Now, maybe I should have said that objects of knowledge, like abstract numbers, are virtually real in God. That might have made it more clear. So while God has knowledge of a rock, God is not a rock. God is the truth of what a rock is, and not the rock itself. When we say that God knows a rock, we mean that God knows the essence and truth of what a rock is. However, this does not imply that God is the rock in a physical or concrete sense. Rather, God is the knowledge or truth of the rock's essence. So too, God is the knowledge or truth of what numbers are. God is not numbers. God is the knowledge and truth of what the number 1 and 3 are without being the numbers 1 and 3. God is the knowledge of their distinction without being that distinction. And so, no, I don't think that this works. That is, God is not the same as the truths of which he has knowledge of, and therefore God is not the numbers 1 and 3, and therefore 1 does not equal 3. Next, Drace points to Gould's argument, but the thing is, God doesn't have any properties, which that argument relies upon. God is not one property. God has 0 properties. God doesn't have the property to create properties. Or excuse me, God doesn't have God doesn't have the property to create properties. God is not a property at all. God's nature is actualizer. He is pure act. So this is just the wrong way to view it. It is God's nature as pure act to actualize potentials, and properties exist potentially. God is the knowledge and truth of potentials without being those potentials. And so I don't think this argument really is addressing the classical theistic God, at least not as St. Thomas Aquinas understands it. Drace goes into the idea of awareness and the principle of proportionate causality, which I do hold to. Whatever is in the effect must in some way be in the cause, even if only virtually. Precisely the reason God can actualize beings that have awareness is because he has awareness in some way, even if only virtually. That is, he is the knowledge of what it means to be aware. When St. Thomas Aquinas says that God is aware, he speaks analogically. So God is not merely, granting us what he already has, but some reflection thereof. Also, what would be the problem if a cause grants what it has to another? If I create a robot that has the ability to move itself freely, is that problematic because I can move freely? I don't think this is the case. And I can still be critical of if awareness or consciousness is to arise from physical simples. There must be some form of proto-awareness or potential for awareness within those physical entities. And if the awareness exists potentially in the physical simples, then we have to introduce non-physical, or rather, let me reword that. Then we have to introduce a non-physical real thing, potentials. But then we must ask, what actual thing has the power to actualize the potentials of awareness? Now, let me try to go through that again. So basically, I'm saying that, listen, let's say these physical simples exist. If awareness or consciousness is to arise from those physical simples, then there has to be some form of consciousness that they have. In order to be the cause of consciousness, they have to have it in some way. In this case, I'm just talking about awareness, like very basic awareness. They have to have that in some way, even if only virtually. And if it exists in any way as some potential, which it must, because in order for those simples to come together in some structure, to form together and to collect together and to create some bigger thing, like you have a bunch of these particles all collected together to make some bigger object, then it has to be within those things the potential to be aware. But if that's true, if there's a potential to be aware, then we've already introduced a non-physical real thing, and that is a potential to be aware, or a potential. In this case, the potential is not a physical thing. It is something non-physical. It's some abstract thing. The real potential to be the case that it can be, let's say, aware in some way. And then finally, we have to ask then, well, what thing exists that has the power to actualize the potential of awareness? Like, so we have this abstract thing, potential to be aware. Well, what actualizes that potential? What thing would have the power to actualize that potential? I would say God. At around 16 minutes into Drace's rebuttal, he mentions my point about how physicalism doesn't account for awareness and suggests it might amount to an argument from ignorance. However, this is a misunderstanding of my position. I'm not dismissing physicalism merely because I don't know how awareness arises under it. Rather, I am open to hearing a coherent account of how physicalism can explain awareness. I am looking for a philosophical explanation, like akin to how we derive geometrical shapes from fundamental properties like extension and duplication, like what I gave in my opening. The problem is that no such account currently exists. If the response is simply something like, we haven't figured that out yet, this highlights a significant weakness in physicalism. Because philosophers have had ample time to logically deduce how physical interactions could rise to give to, or could rise and somehow become aware, yet no satisfactory explanation has emerged. This suggests a deeper issue than mere ignorance. It indicates a potential inadequacy in the physicalist framework itself. Moreover, this isn't about gaps in scientific knowledge, but about the conceptual underpinnings of physicalism. We should be able to start with conceivable physical properties and deduce how their interactions could result in awareness. This is like a logical exercise, which all like metaphysicians do. Start with whatever you want. Claim whatever physical properties you want to exist, so long as it makes sense that we would agree they are physical properties, such as, I don't know, like the extension, such as charge, such as attraction, repulsion, duplication, space, time, all these physical properties. Then once you have all the physical symbols that you want to exist, then just explain logically through some sort of deduction how we get to awareness from those properties. And this should be possible, and we've had a long time to try to do it, and we haven't yet done that, not to my knowledge. And again, I did something for myself. I said, okay, I gave an example. Here's a bunch of physical properties, and from these physical properties, shapes don't exist. There's no such thing as a square or triangle, but I showed how I can logically deduce and derive at a square or triangle starting from those very basic physical properties. We should be able to do the same for awareness. That is very basic awareness. I'm not even talking about deep consciousness here. So we should be able to start with like a conceivable physical properties and deduce their interactions and how that could result in awareness. I think the persistent failure to do so over centuries implies that it might be fundamentally impossible to account for awareness purely in physical terms. This persistent explanatory gap is a critical flaw in physicalism that cannot be dismissed lightly. We are not bound to believe in physicalism. If I offer an alternative view of classical theism, which begins with natural philosophy, like what is change, a physical observation that most agree upon, right, is that change happens. Using the argument from change, we derive the concept, that which is purely actual. From this perspective, we can account for awareness. So I'm actually glad that Drace has granted me to go over time in this rebuttal, because he went like 6 minutes over time in his first rebuttal, because I might need it. Drace then goes on in his rebuttal to talk about how there are philosophical accounts of awareness. But these examples don't start from like physical symbols. Really, they're just scientific ideas or hypotheses. Like higher order theories, as proposed by philosophers like David Rosenthal and Peter Caruthers, I'm not sure how that's said. These theories explain that a mental state becomes conscious when there is a higher order representation of that state, or like global workspace theory, GMT, developed by Bernard Beers and expanded on by Stanislas Dehaene. I'm not sure if that's how that's said. Anyway, we can shorten it to GWT. It posits that consciousness results from the global broadcasting of information across the brain. This model identifies neural correlates and cognitive architectures involved in conscious processing. But again, it begins with sophisticated neural activities and brain regions, not the fundamental physical symbols of the world, starting with fundamental properties and logically deducing how awareness could ever possibly arise. Imagine asking how a light bulb works and receiving an explanation that starts with the entire electrical system of a house. The explanation might describe how electricity flows through the wiring and how the light switch operates and how the light bulb lights up when the switch is flipped. While this provides valuable information about the functioning of the light bulb within the broader electrical system, it skips over the fundamental details of how the light is produced at the most basic level. And it looks like I do need those extra minutes. What you actually asked for was a detailed explanation starting from physical symbols like charge, how electrons move within the filament, how this movement generates light through resistance and incandescence, and how these processes at an atomic level combine to produce visible light. I'm actually skipping over a lot of work I'd have to do there, but we could start with physical symbols and then through just logical deduction come to the conclusion of how light would be produced. Similarly, when we discuss consciousness, starting with complex neural networks and cognitive processes is like higher order theories and global workspace theory provides useful insights, but it skips the fundamental explanation. What we need is a step-by-step account beginning with the most basic physical entities, showing how their interactions can logically lead to awareness. Without this, the explanation remains incomplete, much like understanding the electrical system without knowing how the light bulb itself produces light, without logically explaining how light would arise from fundamental symbols. I think I have enough time, hopefully, to go over these last points here. So I think Dreis got confused with what I was saying about colors, and that could have been my fault. So I'm not saying that colors are physically real, but they are non-physically real. That is, they're not physical things at all. Somehow our minds are seeing things that do not exist in the world, like the color purple. The color purple is not a color in the world. It is not on the color spectrum anywhere. I'm not talking about violet, but purple. It is something we perceive for some reason when red and blue wavelengths stimulate our cones. It doesn't matter how the brain interprets those signals or how many layers or processes the signal goes through or what parts of the brain are involved. The end result is that somehow we see a non-physical color, and that is purple. Again, purple is not something that exists in the world anywhere. It's not a physical property. It's nowhere to be found anywhere except for in our perception, within our mind. So Dreis then talks about how the discreteness of white is controlled by a lack of wavelength dominance in its simultaneous simulation of the three cones. However, this explanation focuses on the physical input aspect and the physiological response of the cone. It doesn't fully address the underlying question of why the brain interprets this specific pattern of stimulation as the color white. Like, yeah, we already understand that, like what happens physically to send a signal into the brain. But why is it that signal that's in the brain, that piece of pattern that's created by the cones and all this stuff, all the parts of the brain, doesn't matter what parts of the brain are involved, none of that is really important, because none of that explains why the consciousness, why we interpret all that data as white to begin with, right? The question remains why the brain consistently translates the equal stimulation into perception of white and not some other color. Why do we perceive all the colors, that is, or rather all the cones of our eye being stimulated, including the other part he talked about, I forget what it was called, that handles like grays, basically. The handles like brightness. But that doesn't explain why it ought to appear as white. Why does a white piece of paper look white? Why does our brain interpret that when that white is nowhere on the color wheel, right? And it's not even intuitive when you think about it. All wavelengths stimulating our cones and other parts of our eye then sends a signal to our brain, and somehow we all come up with this idea of whiteness. We all interpret that as white. Why is that the case? So he talks about maybe there's an evolutionary reason why we evolved the ability to see colors. But while evolution can explain why we perceive colors in general, like how this ability benefited our ancestors because we can see bright things and being able to see brighter colors, or the difference between colors is kind of contrast, helps survivability. We can see maybe certain things that are good to eat versus not good to eat. It doesn't fully explain why brains interpret the signal from, let's say, are blue and red cones being stimulated equally as purple, a color that doesn't exist on the color spectrum. So this is again the problem of explaining why the light bulb lights up by saying, well, because I flipped this switch and then electricity goes to the light bulb. But none of that explains like the fundamentals of what physical properties logically give rise to light in the first place. That's what I'm asking for, the metaphysics here. I'm asking for the philosophy here, not the science. Because the science isn't going to give me that answer. The science is just going to say, as a brute fact, well, you just see purple when that signal, when the red and blue cones are stimulated and it sends a signal to the brain, it's just a brute fact. For whatever reason, that's just how consciousness does it. But it's conscious does this universally. All brains, unless they have like color blindness, see purple. And all brains see a white piece of paper as a white piece of paper. And that's weird. You have to wonder, how is the consciousness deciding to do this thing? And it does so across the entire species. Evolution doesn't give us the answer to why this is the case and not some other thing. That is, why do we perceive it as purple and not some other color that we can't imagine right now? All right, so I did actually use the full 6 minutes. Didn't think I was going to have to do that. All right, I'm done. Thank you for listening.